If you've ever been the victim of a bad storyteller, I don't just mean somebody who is not really good at telling a story, the ones that loop back and they forget things. We'll talk about that in a minute. But I'm talking about the ones who tell stories that are bad stories. Then you know exactly what I'm talking about. You've heard them. And the worst part is when that bad storyteller is the same one that brushes your teeth every day. That's what I want to talk about in this episode of Leading Leaders. I'm Loren Norris with Leading Leaders Podcast. And I just want you to know there are people who tell really bad stories. And for today's sake, trust me, I have a whole list of what the bad acrostic looks like. But for today's sake, we're going to address three particular definitions of bad: boring, acrimonious, and divisive. A story that you might tell yourself, that you might look in the mirror and remind yourself what life was like when you were younger. Maybe it was the relationships that you had with your parents, or the relationship you had with school, or the relationship you had with yourself because you looked in the mirror and you thought, I have way too many pounds on my body. I have way too many dots on my body. Maybe they're freckles, maybe they're zits, but I don't like this person that's looking back at me in the mirror. And so you begin this script writing campaign all on your own. And you tell stories about you to you that are divisive, however you want to pronounce that word. But they keep you from becoming one with yourself. I know that sounds like a big esoteric phrase, maybe a little religious or woo-woo or foo-foo or however you want to say it. You don't really think of becoming one with yourself. And yet, when you don't become one with yourself, when you can't look at the mirror and see that person looking back at you, you go, you're an okay kind of guy. Or you're an okay kind of gal. I like you. If you can't look in the mirror and say, I like you, then you're going to find yourself in a world of hurt. You're going to find yourself struggling with your own identity. And that struggle is going to keep you from the levels of success that you're made for. I'm not kidding when I say they will rob you of your potential. They'll rob you of your future. The stories, just the stories. Maybe you've never heard the word acrimonious. I encourage you to look it up, but it usually has to do with being bitter and angry in the way you craft your language, the things that you say about yourself, to other people. And the challenge really is that if you're bitter with you, if you haven't let yourself off the hook for the mistakes that you've made, the things that you've done, that test that you failed in the third grade, the one that if you passed the test, you'd gone on to the next grade, you'd kind of skip the whole third grade. But now you're looking back at yourself saying, I could have graduated a whole year earlier. I could have been out of college a whole year earlier. I wouldn't have been in the same place when I got out of college. I would have married a different person. And here I am in this part in my life, and it's just not what I wanted it to be. And it's all because of that third grade test. Oh, yes, I know people who talk just like that. They think just like that, and they feel just like that because at some point in their life, something didn't go right, and they are looking for a point and a person to blame. They're looking for a point in time when it all went off the rails and a person to hold accountable for that. And if there's no one else to hold accountable for that, they will hold themselves accountable for that. Well, if that causes you to tell acrimonious stories later, to tell stories of bitterness and hatred and anger, and the only subject of all of those things, the only object, the only person being pointed at is you are sabotaging your own future. Yep, true story. You're dividing yourself. You have more than one vision. You have one vision that says, these are the hopes and the dreams that I have. I want to go forward with this. I want to build. I want to accomplish. I want to succeed. I want to build a legacy. I want people to know who I was. I want the world to have been different because I was here. And on the other hand, you're looking at the person in the mirror going, but this individual can't pull that off. I don't even like this individual. I hope you can see how much of a problem that can be. Do you tell stories that are boring? Meaning you look back on yourself, you look back on your own life, your own relationships, your own accomplishments, your own what you've been and who you've been up to this point in time. And, well, it's just not a very exciting journey. It's not even really worth telling. I was watching a movie last night, and one of the guys referred to himself in that movie as Nobody. And so they called him Mr. Nobody. And no, it wasn't the Fast and Furious series. It was another movie where a person referred to himself as Mr. Nobody. And it's fascinating when you ask the question, what would be behind Mr. Nobody? Is it an attempt to be anonymous because you're so well accomplished that if anybody knew who you were, they'd be after you? Or is it a self-esteem issue? Do you look in the mirror and see nobody? No accomplishments, no grand successes, no impact left in the world, just nobody. I'm nobody. If you walked into a room of strangers and somebody came up and shook your hand and said, "Hi, who are you? My name is so-and-so and I do such and such." How do you answer that? Is it with your identity statement? Is it with your elevator pitch? Is it with your brand? Do you look around in the audience and think, well, who am I in comparison to all the people in this room? Do I have the kind of education or opportunity that they have? Have I accomplished what they've accomplished? Do I fit with the people in this room? Who am I compared to them? Well, there's your flaw. Compared to them really has nothing to do with it. Who am I, on the other hand, is probably one of the hardest questions to answer. I'd put it right up there with, what do you want? What do you want? Now, we can take that same question, what do you want, and lay it next to, who am I? And suddenly we have a whole list of stories. Because most people have crafted plenty of stories for their own life, in their leadership role, in their getting to where they are, that identify who they are. The who am I statement is built in the stories that we've been telling ourselves since we were old enough to repeat stories in our head. I've watched little videos, reels of babies trying to put a sock on. And after they can't get the sock on the fourth, fifth, or sixth time, they just throw it across the room and they scream. Or they throw themselves back and slam their head on the floor and throw a temper tantrum. Sometimes they'll get up and take the sock to somebody and say, I need help. Now, these toddlers, they're already discovering something about themselves. And I'd be willing to bet that the behavior that causes them to throw the sock across the room, scream in frustration and anxiety, throw their head back and hit the floor, or outbursts of profanity, which some of those are in those video reels as well, those are learned behaviors. They've observed that. They've seen other people in their environment scream when they didn't get their way, throw a temper tantrum, slam themselves against the wall, or sometimes proverbially, sometimes in reality. But they've learned that the way to react to dissatisfaction, to not getting your way, is to throw a temper tantrum. Have you seen any adults act that way? Sure you have. Why? Well, because they're still telling the same story. The same story they've had since they were 14, 18, 24 months old. If you don't get your way, you throw a fit. And until someone confronts and corrects that thought process, that story is going to keep replaying. I'm not getting my way right now, so I'll cry. There was a video released recently of a daughter of a sheriff who was a little inebriated, tried to park on top of a telephone pole, damaged her car, did some damage to the light pole, left the scene, went to the gas station down the road. When the police pulled up, she told them who her father was and expected daddy to get her out of trouble. When he didn't, she started screaming for mom. I bet when she put her socks on and she had a hard time with that, she threw a temper tantrum. When you don't get your way, you scream and you cry until you get your way. The world shapes to my will, right? See, the stories that you're telling yourself, if they're bad stories, maybe they're boring, maybe they're acrimonious, maybe they're divisive. Maybe they're not just in your head. Maybe they're everybody around you is a victim of those stories as well, because you are convinced that the story that's playing in your head also applies to everyone around you. Everyone around you should be thinking just like you. Everyone around you should be bending to your will when you emotionally outburst. Everyone around you should do exactly what you want them to do. And the more definitive you are about the way that you state that, the more likely they are to control themselves in the way that you tell them to. No, usually not. In fact, most people have just enough of a stubborn streak that the more emphatic you are about the way they should behave, the more likely they're not to. They're going to push against that. They're going to act contrary on purpose. Why? Because the same story is playing in their head. If I'm not getting my way, throw a temper tantrum. If I'm out of control of the moment, I should force myself, be a little more forceful with what I say. You see it all the time. I walk through the grocery store and I see a toddler kind of meandering through the aisle, and some parent has their head on the back of their head like a steering wheel, and they're pushing them from one side of the aisle to the other. They're tugging on an ear, they're yanking on a collar, they're yelling and they're screaming, and I'm thinking, it's a toddler. I mean, unless they're far enough away that somebody else could snatch them and run off, or they're maliciously destroying things in the store, let them wander. Just keep a closer eye on them. But let them be a toddler, for heaven's sake. It's that need for maximum control that causes someone to act that way. Well, where did that start? In a story inside their head. They've been telling that story for a long time, and it may have a perfectly legitimate origin. It may be that they've actually left a kid behind in the mall. Done that. I lost the same kid twice. True story. But if I spent my life telling myself the story that I've lost my kid in the mall, I'm a horrible parent, I'll never be successful at anything in life, I can't even keep up with my own kids, how could I keep up with anything else? If I spent my life telling myself that story, I would doom myself to failure. Are there things in life that I want to accomplish that I haven't yet? Yes. Do I tell my story that I will never succeed at those things because I haven't yet? No. Did I at one time? Oh yeah. Oh yeah. For many years of my life, I was the most destructive force in my life. The stories that I told were damaging, destructive, divisive, dividing my own vision. I want to do this, but I'm not good enough. I want to do this. Let me give away the idea so that somebody else will accomplish it first, just in case there's a chance that if I did it, I would mess it up. I'm very consciously aware of those kind of stories playing in my head, and I'm very intentional about diverting them, destroying them, and rebuilding a new story. What's fascinating when I work with coaching clients, many start off in the role of, I want to be a better communicator. And what they don't realize is that when I start squeezing the pineapple, so to speak, which is what I tell them, you can't squeeze a pineapple hard enough to get ketchup out of it. But as you're getting prepared to speak from a platform, whether it's a digital platform like this, or it's in a campaign, an ad campaign, a marketing campaign, a political campaign, a fundraising campaign, it doesn't matter. A longer project where you can't just tell one story, you've got to tell a series of stories to lead people to understand the larger picture of what you're working on. As you're working on that process, it's inevitable, absolutely inevitable, that when we start mining these stories, we're going to stumble across stories that define you. You can't not. Kind of like you can't put a foundation for a house without digging in the dirt a bigger hole than you had to start with to build a poor foundation that's at least the support necessary to hold your building on the ground and keep it from falling into the ground. So you're going to have to dig before you can build. You can't just build on top of what you already have. You've got to dig before you build, and that's what I do. But see, my job is to put the pressure on the pineapple and see what comes out when it's under pressure. That pineapple being your soul, your mind, your will, your emotions. Because that's where the stories come from. The good ones and the bad ones. And my job as a communications coach and a leadership coach is to dig. It's to squeeze the pineapple, to see what's really in there. And as I do that, what's going to happen to you is you're going to begin to see some stories that you've only told subconsciously in your mind. You haven't been consciously aware of them in a while, or perhaps never. And as we dig through these stories and you start to tell stories that you didn't realize you were telling yourself, and you start to tell them out loud, and you're like, oh my gosh, where did that story come from? There's probably a little bit of historical marker around there somewhere that we could point out and go, oh yeah, there was that one moment. There's a great book called Early Childhood Memories. I believe it's by Kevin Leman. And in Early Childhood Memories, he talks about how events happen in that age range between 3 and 7, sometimes 3 and 10 years old. And the very first childhood memory tends to be like the crafting of art in wet cement. Once that imprint is there, you have to intentionally break up the cement and pour new cement until, in order for that story to go away. And until you do, that story stays like the grooves in a record. It's not going away. He tells the story of a woman who comes to him and she says, I have a great marriage. I have a great husband. I have, a house full of kids. We're always involved in soccer and Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts and Kiwanis, and we're always at the church, and we're teaching classes, and we're volunteering during services. Everything in our life is going the way that it's supposed to be, but I feel like I just haven't accomplished anything in my life. And so Dr. Lehman, I believe it was, says, tell me about your earliest childhood memory. Not the story somebody else told you, but the one that you vividly remember. You can remember the places, the people, the things, how you felt, what was going on. Not from history recall, but because you were there when it happened. And she sat for a few minutes and she said, I don't really have any of those. He goes, sure you do. Just tell me anything, random as it is. It doesn't matter how silly it is or if it makes any sense. It doesn't even have to be a profound story. I'm just looking for the earliest one you recall. And she says, well, my dad was a traveling salesman. And he'd be gone 5, 6, 7 days at a time. And when he came home in his company car, he would often come in late on a Friday night and then nap all day Saturday. And then we'd get to spend the day with him Sunday and he'd be gone again. And on one particular Saturday, he came home. It had been raining all week and his car was a mess. And so I took it on myself to get a bucket and wash his car. And I washed his whole car for him. And I was so excited for him to see that I had washed his car for him at 5 years old, that I woke him up from his nap to show him that I had washed his car for him. And he came out the door and he looked at the car and he didn't say, what an awesome job you did on my car. Nor did he say, what an awful job you did on my car. In fact, he said nothing. He went back inside, took off his pajamas, put on his work clothes, came out and washed the entire car again. That story playing in that little 5-year-old's head for the last 25, 35 years is exactly the same. No matter what I do, it's not enough. It's not good enough. It's not complete. And no matter how hard I try, somebody's going to have to do it again. And if you look at the evidence in her life right now, the evidence in her life says, I'm not good enough. All of the activities that my kids were involved in, all of the happiness in my home, the happy husband at a great house, and it's really just not enough. I need to do more. I need to do something else. She's telling a bad story. But see, that bad story is crafted in wet cement in a moment in time that she believed everything that was said, and she doesn't know how to undo it. And that story that's replaying right now, it's in the subconscious mind. And in the subconscious mind, there is no difference between yesterday and tomorrow, between real and imaginary, between true and untrue. If the story is playing, that's what life is. I'd be willing to bet as a leader that you are often looking in the mirror and working on that divisive mind. I want this, but I am this. And if those two are not congruent, then the story you're telling yourself is actually destroying you from within. But it's also very possible that you have people on your team who are doing exactly the same thing. The story that they're telling in their own head Well, it's destroying their future, their opportunities, their relationships. They can't close the sale. They can't keep the deal on track. They can't keep an employee under them who doesn't quit because the story they're telling themselves, it's a painful, broken story. They may have it all together on the outside, but on the inside, they're a mess. They may be your team members. They may be your employees. Could be your boss. But until you get these stories under control and you're intentional with them, until you break up the ground where the concrete has already settled and the stories in it are not good stories, until you start to tell better stories, that path isn't going to change. That horizon isn't going to brighten up. That legacy isn't going to be left the way you want it to be. If you're still telling bad stories from your childhood, bad stories from past relationships, bad stories from trauma, it's what happens to a lot of soldiers. They come back from combat, and the stories that own their mind and memories are the bad stories of horrible, horrible things they've seen and done. And if those stories drive them, they can drive them crazy. They can drive them to a place where they can't cope with life. Or those stories can be rewritten, looked at through a new perspective. As a leader, your role is to identify those bad stories in yourself, in the people you lead, in the people you influence. Identify those bad stories and help to identify them enough that someone else can look at them and go, "You're right, that's a bad story, I need to get rid of it." And then walk them through a process of breaking it up and writing another story. And if you need help with that, that's what I do. That's what I'm here for. I teach people to tell better stories better so the bad stories don't dominate your life. I'm Loren Norris with Leading Leaders Podcast for Tell It Like It Is TV. Have a blessed day. Subscribe now for our extensive video library of leadership lessons promoting faith, family, and freedom.
That I was praying, God, he just needs this thing broken in his life. He's become involved in that class. And there's real spiritual change and real physical change happening in this guy's life.
Today on Transforming Grace TV.
Succumb to addiction, and I would succumb to pornography. And the residual effect of that in my life and my children and my household and my other relationships, mind-boggling. And yet I knew there was a call in my life. And I think that tension is what pulls men apart in the churches, and it pulls families apart. That to me is heartbreaking. My opinion too is that the body of Christ has a tendency to crucify our wounded.
Transforming Grace TV passionately reveals hope in broken relationships. Stay tuned. Experience God's transforming grace.